I planned my dream wedding for 18 months, and my maid of honor announced her own engagement at my rehearsal dinner, and somehow made everyone think I was the one being unreasonable. There is a specific kind of anger that doesn't feel like anger at first. It feels like confusion. It feels like standing in the middle of a room you know very well and suddenly being unable to locate the door. Everything looks familiar and nothing makes sense, and you keep turning around thinking you must be missing something obvious, some detail that will make the whole thing click into place and become reasonable. I stood in that room for about 3 days after my rehearsal dinner, before I stopped looking for the door and accepted that the room itself was the problem. My name is Claire. I got married 18 months after I got engaged, which is a normal amount of time if you are the kind of person who wants things to be right rather than just done. I am that kind of person. I have always been that kind of person. I make lists, I keep spreadsheets, I follow up on things. My husband Daniel knew this about me before he proposed and proposed anyway, which I consider evidence of genuine love. My maid of honor was a woman named Natalie. We had been friends for 9 years. We met in our mid-20s at a pottery class that neither of us was particularly good at, and we bonded over being equally bad at it and equally unwilling to admit defeat and leave. She was funny and loud and generous in the way that people who grew up without much tend to be generous, and I loved her in that specific way you love someone who came into your life at exactly the right moment and stayed. She was my first call when Daniel proposed. She cried, I cried. She said yes before I had finished asking. I want to establish that clearly because it matters for understanding how long it took me to see what was happening. Natalie was not a stranger. She was not someone I had misjudged from a distance. She was someone I had trusted completely for nearly a decade, someone who had been present for every significant thing in my life since we met, someone who I had supported through 2 breakups, a job loss, a difficult move, and a period of real financial hardship where I had helped her in ways I had never asked her to acknowledge or repay. I knew her, or I thought I did. The 18 months of planning were, for the most part, exactly what I had hoped they would be. I loved the process. I know that's not a universal experience. A lot of people find wedding planning stressful in a way that makes them wish they had eloped, and I completely understand that, but for me it was genuinely enjoyable. I liked the decisions. I liked the narrowing down of options. I liked having a project with a clear end point, and a reason to think carefully about every element of something that mattered to me. Natalie was involved from the beginning. She came to venue tastings and florist consultations, and she sat with me on my couch for 4 hours one Sunday afternoon, while I showed her photographs of centerpiece arrangements, and she gave genuine, considered opinions about each one. She helped me choose my dress, which was an experience I will always remember warmly regardless of everything that happened afterward. She held my hand in the dressing room of the 4th Bridal Boutique when I put on a dress that made me cry, and she was crying too, and the woman working with us was crying, and all 3 of us stood there in this small mirrored room being completely overwhelmed by a dress, which is objectively a little absurd and also one of my favorite memories. She was good at being a maid of honor. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She was attentive and enthusiastic, and she showed up for every single thing I asked her to show up for without complaint. She organized the bridal shower with a level of care and detail that moved me genuinely. She handled logistics with the other bridesmaids in a way that kept everything running smoothly. She was, for 17.5 months, exactly the person I had chosen her to be. Which is why the rehearsal dinner hit the way it did. I need to describe the rehearsal dinner to you because the details matter. It was the evening before my wedding. Daniel and I had chosen a private room at a restaurant we both loved, a place with warm lighting and good food, and a level of intimacy that suited a gathering of about 30 people. It was immediate family and the wedding party and a handful of close friends. The people who mattered most to us gathered the night before the thing we had been working toward for 1.5 years. The plan for the evening was simple. Dinner, a few short toasts, some time to breathe and connect before the next day. Daniel's best man gave a toast. My mother gave a toast. Both were warm and funny in the appropriate amounts, and the room felt exactly the way I had hoped it would feel. Easy, happy, a little emotional in the good way. I was sitting at the head of the table next to Daniel, and I remember thinking, at some point during my mother's toast, that everything was going exactly right. Then Natalie stood up. She was holding a glass of champagne, and she had that particular expression on her face that I had seen before, the one she gets when she's excited about something and working hard to contain it. I assumed she was about to give her toast. She had mentioned earlier that week that she had been working on something, and I had told her to keep it a surprise, that I trusted her, that whatever she said would be perfect. She thanked everyone for being there. She talked about me and Daniel for about 2 minutes in a way that was genuinely beautiful, warm and specific and funny in the right moments, the kind of toast that makes the person it's about feel truly seen. I was smiling. I was actually tearing up a little. And then she said she hoped I would forgive her for taking one small moment because she had some news of her own that she simply could not keep inside any longer. She looked across the table at her boyfriend Ryan, who had been with her for about 2 years, and she said his name, and he stood up, and he got down on one knee, and he proposed to her in the middle of my rehearsal dinner. The room erupted, people cheered, someone clinked a glass. Natalie said yes, which I suppose was not a surprise given that she had clearly coordinated the whole thing in advance, and there was hugging and crying, and the particular energy of a group of people who have just been surprised, and are responding to the surprise with immediate and uncomplicated joy. I sat very still. I'm a person who manages her reactions in real time. I have been doing it my whole life. It is not always a virtue, but in that moment it meant that nobody at that table, except possibly Daniel, who knows me better than anyone, could have seen on my face what I was actually feeling. I smiled. I clapped. I reached across the table and squeezed Natalie's hand when she held it out to me, and I told her congratulations, and I meant it in the narrow technical sense that I genuinely did wish her happiness, while simultaneously feeling something else entirely that I did not have the space or the safety to express in that room. Daniel put his hand on my knee under the table. That was the whole communication. Just his hand on my knee, steady and warm. That was enough to tell me he saw it. The rest of the dinner passed. People gradually redistributed their attention back to the wedding, to me and Daniel, to the next day. Natalie was glowing in the way newly engaged people glow, and it was genuine, and it was hard to look at directly for reasons I was still in the process of identifying. I made it through dessert. I made it through the goodbyes. I made it to the car. And then I sat in the passenger seat and stared at the windshield for a long moment, and said to Daniel, in a very calm and even voice, that I needed him to tell me if I was being crazy. He said I was not being crazy. I want to be precise about what I was feeling in that moment because I spent a lot of time afterward trying to articulate it to people who hadn't been there, and the articulation was harder than I expected. I was not angry that Natalie was engaged. I was genuinely happy for her and Ryan, who were good together and who deserved good things. I was not angry that the timing was close to my wedding, because you cannot always choose when someone proposes to you. I was not angry that she had announced it publicly rather than telling me privately first, though I had feelings about that too. What I was angry about was the location, the deliberate choice of that room, that night, that moment, with those 30 people. The decision to take the one evening that existed specifically to be about me and Daniel and our wedding and use it as the backdrop for her own announcement. The fact that she had planned it in advance, coordinated with Ryan, chosen the moment carefully, and had not once in all of that planning stopped to ask herself whether her best friend, whose rehearsal dinner this was, might have feelings about it. That was the thing I kept turning over in the car on the way home. The planning, the coordination, the advanced decision. Because a spontaneous moment is one thing. Feelings are hard to contain and joy is real, and sometimes things come out at the wrong time because humans are imperfect and emotions are not always well behaved. I would have understood that. I would have been fine with that, but this was not spontaneous. This was organized. Ryan had a ring. Ryan got down on one knee. They had chosen this night together in advance, and nobody had thought to mention it to me. Daniel drove and didn't say much, which was exactly right. He knew I needed to process rather than talk. By the time we got home, I had moved through the first layer of it and was starting to feel the thing underneath, which was not just anger about the dinner, but a more complicated feeling about what the dinner meant, about what it said about how Natalie had thought about me when she was making that decision. Because if you plan something like that in advance, you think about it, you consider it, you sit with the choice and you weigh it. And somewhere in that process, Natalie had weighed my rehearsal dinner against her desire to announce her engagement to our friend group in a memorable setting, and had decided that her desire was more important. She had made that calculation consciously, and had come to a conclusion that did not include my feelings as a significant factor. That was the thing that sat in my chest when I tried to go to sleep the night before my wedding. I did go to sleep eventually. I had a wedding in the morning, and I was not going to let anything take that from me. I closed my eyes and I focused on Daniel and on the next day, and I put everything else in a box and set it aside. I got married the next morning in a ceremony that was exactly what I had spent 18 months working toward, with people I loved surrounding me, in a dress that had made 3 women cry in a small mirrored room. It was a beautiful day. I want to be clear about that. Nothing about what Natalie had done the night before touched what happened the next day. But the box was still there when the day ended. The honeymoon was 2 weeks in Portugal, which was exactly what both of us needed. Daniel and I don't talk about difficult things on vacation as a general rule, not because we avoid conflict, but because we have learned over the years that distance and rest change the shape of problems in ways that are useful, and that some things are better examined after you have slept well and eaten good food, and spent time remembering what your life actually looks like when it isn't organized around a grievance. So we didn't talk about Natalie much. We talked about her once briefly on the 4th day, sitting at a small table outside a cafe in Lisbon with coffee and pastries, and the particular golden light that Portugal does better than almost anywhere. I said I still didn't know what I was going to do about it. Daniel said I didn't have to know yet. We finished our coffee and walked down a cobblestone street, and that was the end of the conversation for another 10 days. By the time we got home, I had settled into something more solid than the raw feeling from the car ride after the dinner. I had moved past the immediate emotional reaction and arrived at a place where I could think about it more clearly, which is a place I generally trust more than the first response. And what I thought, looking at it clearly, was that I needed to talk to Natalie, not to deliver a verdict. Not to end the friendship or punish her or make her feel bad about her engagement, which was a real and good thing in her life that had nothing wrong with it, but because something had happened that I had not been able to address in real time, and that was sitting between us whether we acknowledged it or not, and I have never been someone who can let things like that sit indefinitely without the weight of them becoming its own problem. I texted her the week after we got back. I kept it simple. I said I was home, that the honeymoon had been wonderful, that I'd love to see her soon and catch up properly. She responded immediately and warmly, the way she always did, and we made plans for lunch the following Saturday. I spent the days between the text and the lunch thinking about how to approach it. I didn't want to go in with a prepared speech, because prepared speeches tend to make the other person feel like they're being tried rather than talked to, and that wasn't the dynamic I was looking for. I wanted a real conversation. I wanted to tell her honestly how I had felt and give her the space to respond to that honestly, and then I wanted to see where we ended up. That seemed like the right approach. That seemed like what you did when you had a friendship of 9 years, and something went wrong inside it. The lunch started well. She was warm and excited and full of wedding planning energy, which I understood because I had just been full of wedding planning energy for 18 months, and it is a consuming state to be in. She showed me the ring, which was beautiful, and I told her it was beautiful and meant it. She talked about venues she had already been researching, and I listened and asked questions, and it felt, for the first 20 minutes, like a perfectly normal lunch between two close friends. Then I told her I wanted to talk about the rehearsal dinner. The shift was immediate, not dramatic, not defensive, but there. Something in her face adjusted, a very small recalibration, and I recognized it because I had seen it before. It was the expression she made when she was preparing to explain herself. She said she had been wondering when I was going to bring it up. I said I hadn't been ready to bring it up until now. She nodded. Then she said she was sorry if it had come across the wrong way, but that Ryan had planned the whole thing and she hadn't wanted to stop him mid-proposal, that it would have been cruel to him to shut it down in front of everyone. I told her I understood that part. I told her I wasn't asking her to have stopped him mid-proposal. I was asking why the two of them had chosen that night in that room, with those people, knowing whose night it was. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that Ryan had thought it would be romantic to propose surrounded by people they both loved, and that most of the people at the rehearsal dinner were their people too, and that he had thought the atmosphere of the evening was perfect for it. She said she had told him she wasn't sure about the timing, but that he had been so excited and so certain, and she hadn't wanted to take that away from him. I sat with that for a second. Then I said, gently, that she had known about it in advance, that she had let it happen knowing it was my rehearsal dinner, that she had made a choice. She said she hadn't really thought of it as making a choice. She said it had all happened quickly, and she had gotten swept up in Ryan's excitement, and before she knew it, the plan was set, and it felt too late to change it without making a big deal out of nothing. Nothing, that word landed quietly, and I let it sit there between us for a moment without filling the space around it. I told her that it hadn't felt like nothing to me. I told her that I had spent the night before my wedding sitting in a car trying to figure out how to feel about something my best friend had done, and that the feeling itself was not what had bothered me most. What had bothered me most was the calculation. The fact that at some point in the planning process someone, either Ryan or her or both of them together, had weighed the location against the occasion and decided it was fine. That was the part I needed her to understand, because without understanding that part, she couldn't understand why I was still thinking about it 3 weeks later. She listened, I will give her that. She didn't interrupt, and she didn't immediately reach for another explanation. She looked at the table, and I could see her actually sitting with what I had said rather than just waiting for her turn to respond. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said she thought I was being a little hard on Ryan, who had just been trying to make a beautiful moment, and that she hoped I wasn't going to let this affect how I felt about their engagement going forward. I want to describe precisely how that sentence landed. It landed like a door closing, not violently, not with any particular force, just the soft, definitive sound of something that was open becoming shut. Because what she had just done, in that one sentence, was take everything I had said about my own experience and reframe it as a problem with my attitude. She had moved the conversation from what happened to how I was responding to what happened. She had made my feelings about the rehearsal dinner into evidence of a flaw in me, specifically a flaw in my generosity toward her and Ryan, rather than a reasonable response to something that had been done without consideration for me. I recognized the move. I had seen it before in other contexts with other people. It is a very specific conversational maneuver, and it is effective precisely because it puts the person on the receiving end in an impossible position. If you continue pressing your original point, you are proving that you are in fact being hard and ungenerous. If you back down, you have implicitly accepted the reframe. Either way, the original grievance disappears from the conversation and gets replaced by a question about your character. I chose not to walk into it. I said I had no issue with their engagement. I said I was happy for them, and I meant that, and I wanted to continue meaning it. I said what I had needed to say, and I wasn't looking for an apology so much as an acknowledgement that she understood why it had landed the way it did. She nodded and said she understood, and something in the way she said it told me she didn't, not fully, but that she was willing to perform understanding well enough for the conversation to end on terms that felt acceptable to both of us. We hugged goodbye outside the restaurant. We texted the following week. On the surface, things went back to normal, but I had seen the move she made and I couldn't unsee it, and it changed the texture of things between us in a way that was subtle enough not to be visible to anyone on the outside, but that I was aware of every time we were together. The next part of this story started about 6 weeks after that lunch, when I got a phone call from one of the other bridesmaids, a woman named Greta who I had known since college, and who had always been reliably honest with me in a way that I valued even when the honesty was uncomfortable. She said she was calling because she thought I should know something. She said she had been at a dinner the previous weekend with a group that included Natalie, and that at some point during the evening, the rehearsal dinner had come up, and that Natalie had described the situation in a way that Greta thought I would want to know about. I asked her what Natalie had said. Greta was quiet for a moment, the way people are quiet when they have something to say that they know is going to land hard. Then she told me. Natalie had told the group that she had apologized to me after the wedding, and that I had been cold and unforgiving about it, that I had made the whole thing into a much bigger deal than it was, and that she was starting to wonder if I had always had a tendency to make things about myself that weren't really about me. She had said it in a tone, Greta described, that invited the people around the table to agree with her, and several of them had, because they only had the version of events she was presenting, and that version was the only one they had access to. I sat with the phone against my ear and listened to Greta finish, and then I was quiet for a moment. Not because I was shocked, exactly, more because I was watching something I had half suspected, but hadn't fully allowed myself to believe become fully real in front of me. The lunch conversation had bothered me not just because of what Natalie had said, but because of what her response had suggested about how she understood the situation. And now I was getting confirmation that her private understanding of it was significantly different from what she had communicated to my face. To my face, she had said she understood. In a room full of mutual acquaintances, she had described me as someone who made things about herself. I thanked Greta for telling me. She said she had gone back and forth about whether to call and had decided I deserved to know. I told her that was the right call, and I meant it completely. We talked for a few more minutes, and then I hung up and sat in my kitchen in the particular stillness that follows the arrival of information you can't unknow. I thought about what to do with it for several days. The most obvious option was to call Natalie and confront her directly about what she had said. There was a version of me that wanted to do exactly that, the version that was angry and wanted the anger to have somewhere to go. But I had been in enough difficult conversations, with enough people to know that confronting someone about what they said behind your back rarely produces the outcome you want. Because the moment you reveal your source, the conversation pivots immediately to a debate about what was actually said, and who told you and whether they got it right, and the original substance gets buried under all of that and never actually gets addressed. So I did something different. I pulled back quietly, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. I just stopped initiating. I stopped being the one to text first, to suggest plans, to reach out. I kept responding when she reached out because I wasn't trying to manufacture confrontation, but I let the natural rhythm of the friendship slow down, and I paid attention to what it looked like when I wasn't the one maintaining its momentum. What it looked like over the following weeks was that the friendship had always required significantly more input from my side than I had realized. When I stopped initiating, the contact dropped sharply, not to zero, but to something much lower than our previous baseline. She texted occasionally, usually when she had wedding planning questions or wanted to share something exciting about the engagement, and I responded warmly and briefly and let those exchanges be what they were. During this period, I also started talking to Daniel more openly about the longer history of the friendship, about patterns I was now seeing more clearly than I had before, not because I was building a case, but because talking to him helped me think. And what I found, going back through 9 years of friendship with fresh eyes, was a set of smaller things that I had absorbed at the time without examining too closely. The pottery class where we'd met, which I had always thought of as a story about two equals bonding over shared failure. But thinking about it now, I remembered that Natalie had been funnier and more confident and more quickly comfortable in that room than I had been, and that the friendship had formed in large part because I had been drawn to her energy rather than the other way around. That wasn't a problem. That was just chemistry, but it was interesting to notice it. The 2 breakups I had helped her through. I had shown up fully for both of them, had spent nights on her couch and hours on the phone and considerable emotional energy being the steady presence she needed. Going back through my own significant moments during those years, I tried to recall her equivalent presence for me. She had been there. She had been kind. But there was an asymmetry I hadn't let myself see clearly before, a difference in the depth of showing up that I had always smoothed over by telling myself that different people expressed support differently and that hers was just quieter. The financial period when she had been struggling and I had helped. I had never asked her to acknowledge it because I hadn't done it for acknowledgement. I had done it because she needed help and I was in a position to give it. But there had been no reciprocal awareness in her, no particular sense from her that what I had done was significant, and at the time I had simply decided that was fine, that good friendships didn't require accounting, which is true. But there is a difference between not requiring accounting and not noticing at all. None of these things on their own were damning. People are imperfect. Friendships are not always perfectly equal. The ebb and flow of who needs more and who gives more changes over time, and that is normal and fine. But taken together, in the context of what had happened at the rehearsal dinner and what she had said about me at that dinner, they formed a picture that was harder to dismiss than any single piece of it. About 2 months after Greta's phone call, Natalie reached out and asked if I wanted to come to an engagement party her future mother-in-law was throwing for her and Ryan. It was a Sunday afternoon event, and she said it would mean a lot to her if I was there. I went because I wasn't trying to end the friendship in a blaze, because she hadn't technically done anything I could point to as a clean and undeniable betrayal, and because the situation was complicated enough that I wanted to give it more time before making any permanent decisions. I got dressed and brought a gift and smiled at people I didn't know very well and stood in a backyard in the afternoon sun and watched Natalie move through the gathering with the glowing confidence of someone who was entirely in her element. At some point during the party, a woman came up to me who I didn't recognize. She introduced herself as a friend of Ryan's family and said she had heard I was Natalie's maid of honor for the wedding. I corrected her gently and said I had been her maid of honor at my own wedding, that Natalie was the maid of honor, and that the roles had been reversed. The woman looked slightly confused and said that Natalie had mentioned I had been her maid of honor in a way that the woman had apparently understood to mean the other direction. I smiled and said there might have been some confusion. The woman moved on. I stood with my glass of something sparkling and let the conversation settle in me. It was a small thing, a minor mix-up, possibly innocent, possibly just an awkward retelling of a complicated situation involving two friends with weddings close together. I was not going to make it into more than it was, but it added to the picture, another small brushstroke in the same direction. Later that evening, after I had gotten home and changed out of my party clothes, I sat on my couch and thought about where I actually was with all of this. Not in an analytical way, not making lists or building arguments, just honestly asking myself how I felt about Natalie and what I wanted from the friendship going forward. What I found, sitting quietly with the question, was that the warmth I had always felt toward her was still there, but that it had changed shape. It was more careful now, more aware of its own edges. I still cared about her. I still wanted good things for her. But the specific quality of trust that had characterized the friendship at its best, the feeling that she was someone who held me carefully, who would weigh my feelings in her decisions, who thought about my experience when she was making choices that affected it, that quality was gone. Not diminished, gone. And I didn't know if a friendship could survive the loss of that particular quality, or if what remained without it was just the pleasant surface of something that had once been deeper, the kind of connection you maintain out of history and habit rather than genuine present investment. I didn't have an answer that night. I went to bed without one. The thing that clarified everything happened about 3 weeks later, and I did not see it coming at all. Natalie called me on a Tuesday evening and said she had something she wanted to ask me. Her voice had that particular quality it got when she was nervous, a slight overbrightness, a pace that was a fraction faster than usual. I said, of course, what was it? She said she had been thinking about her wedding party, and she wanted to ask me to be her maid of honor. I did not say anything for a moment. She kept talking into the silence. She said she knew it was a big ask given everything, and she completely understood if I wasn't in a place to do it, but that I was her closest friend and she couldn't imagine anyone else standing next to her, and that she hoped we could put the rehearsal dinner stuff behind us completely and move forward. She said she wanted me there more than she could say. I sat with the phone in my hand and felt the full weight of the question settle over me like something very heavy arriving very slowly. I want to describe what it felt like to sit with that question, because the feeling was more complicated than I expected it to be. Part of me had a very immediate and clear reaction, a clean internal no that arrived before I had even consciously processed what she was asking. But another part of me was already doing the thing I always do, already running through the considerations, already thinking about the history and what she meant to me, and how many years we had been through together, and whether saying no to this was the same as saying no to all of it. That second part of me is the part that has gotten me into trouble before, the part that is so aware of the complexity of things that it can talk itself out of the clear response and into the complicated one. I recognized it doing its work, and I made a conscious decision to let the first response speak instead. I told her I needed a few days to think about it. She said, of course, absolutely, take all the time I needed. We hung up and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. I called Greta that night, not to ask her what to do because I already knew what I was going to do, but because I needed to say it out loud to someone who understood the full context before I said it to Natalie. Greta listened to the whole thing. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said that it sounded like I already knew my answer. I said I did. She said she thought it was the right one. I thought about it for 2 more days anyway, not because I was wavering, but because I wanted to be certain I was making the decision from a grounded place rather than from the residue of old hurt. By the 3rd day I was certain. I called Natalie. I told her I was honored that she had asked me. I meant that. Being asked to stand next to someone on the most significant day of their life is not a small thing, and I did not treat it as one. I told her I had thought about it carefully and that I wasn't going to be able to say yes, and that I wanted to explain why, not to hurt her but because I thought she deserved an honest answer rather than an excuse. I told her that the rehearsal dinner had affected me more than I had been able to fully communicate at our lunch. I told her that what Greta had shared with me about the dinner, where Natalie had described me as someone who made things about herself, had landed hard, not because I couldn't handle criticism, but because it had told me something about the gap between what she said to my face and what she said when I wasn't there. I told her that I had spent the months since then paying attention to the friendship in a way I hadn't before, and that what I had found had made me realize that something important had shifted between us, and that I wasn't sure it could be unshifted just by deciding to move forward. I told her that I couldn't be a good maid of honor to someone I was still in the process of figuring out how to trust, that it wouldn't be fair to her, because a maid of honor who is working through complicated feelings about the person she's standing next to is not the maid of honor either of them deserves, and that it wouldn't be fair to me, because I had just spent 18 months being someone else's maid of honor, and I knew what the role required, and I wasn't in a place to give it. The silence on the other end was long. Then she said my name in a tone I had heard her use before, the tone that preceded a reframe, and I recognized it before the sentence arrived. She said she was hurt that I was bringing up the dinner again after she had apologized. She said she felt like no matter what she did I was going to keep holding it over her. She said she thought I had told her at our lunch that we were okay, and that she had believed me, and now I was using it as a reason to say no to something that was important to her, and she needed me to understand how that felt from where she was standing. I let her finish, then I said calmly that I had said at our lunch that I had no issue with her engagement, which was true and remained true. I had not said that the way she had responded to my feelings about the rehearsal dinner hadn't affected me. Those were different things. And I said that I noticed she had not addressed the specific thing I had mentioned, the dinner with mutual friends, the way she had described me there. She went quiet again. Then she said she didn't know exactly what Greta had told me, but that she had probably been venting, and that venting to friends was something everyone did, and she hadn't meant for it to get back to me. I said I understood that. I said I also wanted her to understand that it had gotten back to me, and that it had given me information I found useful. Not a weapon, information. Information about what she actually thought when she wasn't managing the conversation carefully. She said she thought I was being cruel. That word surprised me. Not because it was completely without emotional logic. I understood why she felt hurt. I understood that rejection lands hard, especially when it's dressed up in honesty. But cruel felt like a significant overreach for what I had done, which was decline a request and explain my reason for declining it. I had not ended the friendship. I had not delivered a list of grievances. I had said no to a specific ask and told her why. I told her I was sorry she felt that way. I told her I hadn't intended cruelty and didn't believe I had been cruel. I told her I still cared about her and that didn't change. And I told her that I hoped she found the right person to stand next to her, because she deserved to have someone genuinely present for her on that day, and I wasn't in a position to be that person right now. We got off the phone shortly after that. The conversation had the feeling of something ending, not explosively, but the way things end when both people know that the thing between them has arrived at a place it can't easily move past. Not a door slamming, just a door at last closing. Within a week, I had heard from 2 mutual friends who had apparently been on the receiving end of Natalie's account of our phone call. The versions varied slightly in detail, but shared a consistent shape. In her telling, I had declined to be her maid of honor as a way of punishing her for the rehearsal dinner, that I had brought up old grievances she had already apologized for, that I had been cold and calculated about it, and that she was genuinely worried about me as a person because this kind of thing, holding grudges and waiting for the right moment to deliver them, wasn't healthy behavior. I was not surprised. I want to be honest about that. By the time those calls came in, I had a clear enough picture of the pattern that the existence of this particular repetition of it did not genuinely shock me. What it did was confirm something I had been turning over for months, which was that Natalie's understanding of our friendship had always been organized primarily around her own experience of it, and that whenever my experience diverged from hers, the divergence was evidence of a problem with me, rather than information worth taking seriously. Every time I had raised something that was real and true for me, she had found a way to make it about my response rather than her action. The rehearsal dinner became about whether I could be generous enough to let it go. The lunch became about whether I was going to make her engagement feel unwelcome. The phone call about the maid of honor ask became about whether I was capable of a healthy friendship at all. Each time the subject changed. Each time I was the one with the problem. That is a recognizable pattern. It has a name in some of the reading I did afterward, though I am wary of reducing people to clinical categories because it flattens the complexity of what they actually are. What I prefer to say is that Natalie was someone who experienced herself as the central figure in every story she was part of, and that this wasn't malice, it was just how she was organized, and that it had been compatible with my way of being for a long time, because I had always been willing to adjust my perspective to accommodate hers. When I stopped being willing to do that, the friendship stopped working. I have thought a lot about why I didn't see it more clearly sooner. Part of the answer is that she was genuinely good to me in many ways and across many years, and the goodness was real even if it was also partial. Part of the answer is that I am someone who defaults to generosity in my interpretations of people I love, which is generally a quality I want to keep even when it sometimes costs me. And part of the answer, the part I have had to sit with the most honestly, is that I was afraid of what seeing it would mean. Because seeing it clearly meant looking back at 9 years of friendship and rereading it, and rereading things is uncomfortable work even when it's necessary. Daniel and I talked about it properly about a month after the phone call with Natalie on a Sunday morning over breakfast, the way we talk about things that have had time to settle. He said something I have thought about since. He said that the loss of a friendship like that, one you had believed in for a long time, was a kind of grief that people didn't always take seriously because it didn't look like the kinds of loss that get acknowledged and supported. He said I was allowed to grieve it. I said I knew. He said he wasn't sure I was actually letting myself. He was right about that, as he is right about most things, which is one of the better qualities in a person to be married to. I did grieve it, quietly and over time, the way you grieve things that don't have a clean moment of ending, but just gradually become the past. I grieved the version of the friendship I had believed I had. I grieved the specific feeling of being known by someone for nearly a decade, which doesn't simply transfer to another person just because you decide to move on. I grieved, if I am being completely honest, some version of myself that had existed inside that friendship, the self that had been easy and generous and willing to smooth things over, the self that had believed the smoothing was enough. That self is not entirely gone. I still have generosity in me, and I hope I always will, but it is more honest now than it used to be. It asks more questions. It pays closer attention to the difference between warmth that is mutual and warmth that is primarily directional. Natalie got married the following spring. I know this because we share enough mutual connections that information moves. She looked happy in the photographs. Ryan looked happy. The wedding looked beautiful. I hope it was everything she wanted it to be, genuinely and without any irony, because whatever happened between us does not change the fact that she is a person deserving of happiness, and I have enough distance from it now to wish her that cleanly. We have not spoken since the phone call. I don't expect that will change. Sometimes friendships that have run their course simply run their course, and the most honest thing you can do is let them, without forcing an ending that announces itself, and without pretending they are still what they no longer are. What I have now is a marriage I love, a circle of friendships that feel more genuinely reciprocal than some of what I had before, and a clearer sense of what I actually need from the people I let close to me. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, quite a lot. The wedding day itself remains what it was, beautiful and true and exactly mine. Natalie was there and she gave a beautiful toast, and I cried at the right parts, and Daniel held my hand, and the room felt the way I had wanted it to feel. And then the dinner happened, and I sat very still and smiled, and something shifted without my permission, and everything that came after was the slow work of understanding what that shift actually meant. I understand it now. It took longer than I expected and cost more than I had budgeted for, but I understand it. And understanding it, even at that price, turns out to be worth quite a lot.